coming on the air with what some officials say could be a potential war crime in Ukraine, with leaders there pointing the finger at Russia after the collapse of a huge dam, water everywhere, thousands out of their homes. The new U.S. intel tonight, based on our sources, that says Moscow may have been behind it. Also tonight, a legitimately stunning twist in the sports world. The PGA Tour teaming up with Saudi-backed LIV Golf with new accusations tonight that money beat morality here. A group of 9/11 families calling it a betrayal. What one of them is telling me in just the last few minutes. Then, in just over an hour from now, a new candidate will jump into the 2024 race. But what is Christie's game plan other than to rag on Donald Trump? We're live in New Hampshire. Plus, new calls for justice in Florida after a woman killed her neighbor, a black mother of 4, through her front door. What else we're finding out tonight? And could Hollywood actors join writers on the picket line? A new vote points to maybe, as they fight for more money and more protection. What it could mean for your favorite movies and shows later on in our show. Hey there, I'm Hallie. And tonight, with Ukraine and Russia pointing the finger at each other for blowing up a dam, multiple sources tell NBC News that new U.S. intelligence leans toward Russia being to blame for what's now a major emergency in southern Ukraine. Look at it. I want to show it to you. All that water, you can see it, has rushed in, flooding something like 70 towns, according to the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. The water level is expected to keep on going up. It is surrounding people's homes. They had to leave. And tonight, the question, whose fault is it? Publicly, no one saying anything definitive about whether it's Moscow's fault. What they are saying is that the Kremlin has a lot to be blamed for already.
The important thing to remember, though, that it was, in fact, Russia that started this war. It was Russia that was occupying this area, and it was Russia that was in control of the dam.
Countries on both sides of the war have been scrambling all day to evacuate people nearby. You see them here. They're going door to door. They're helping folks try to get onto buses to somewhere safe. The reason this is such a big deal, this dam is in an important part of the country. Its reservoir gives water to farmers, to people who live in the area. That water also helps cool a nearby nuclear plant controlled by Russia. Now, what does Russia say? Well, they say this whole thing isn't on them, this whole disaster. They accuse Ukraine of what they call a terrorist attack after a failed attempt at a counteroffensive. It has echoes of history, with U.S. and Western officials reminding us that 80 years ago, former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin blew up a dam in Ukraine to stop an enemy advance as the Nazis were sweeping through the country. Molly Hunter is in Kyiv with the latest on the concerns in Ukraine.
I'll run you through kind of the top 3 concerns in the next 24 hours. Fresh water, that is going to be a huge issue. And one energy analyst I spoke with earlier today estimates that 300,000 people, so not just those tens of thousands who live in those low-lying villages that are getting immediately affected by the flooding, but 300,000 people will be without drinkable water by tonight. An additional 500,000 will be affected by power outages and flooding. And then we are watching that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant very, very closely. Of course, the fear is it is under Russian occupation. The fear is that it used to get previously, as of a couple of days ago, get all of its water and its power from the reservoir attached to this dam. Well, that's no longer possible. I sat down with the head of Ukraine's state nuclear energy company to ask about this, and he said, actually, on the upside, well, if there is a relative upside, he said the panic is not in this initial 24 hours. Because if all those reactors are actually offline, the water levels in those key cooling pools are actually stable and will remain stable for at least another couple of weeks.
Molly Hunter in Ukraine for us tonight. I want to get to Josh Letterman to talk to me more about some of the diplomatic developments here, because you've seen officials from both Russia and Ukraine using words like ecological disaster to describe this. Let's start with sort of the damage and the finger pointing here, because there's been a lot of it tonight.
An ecological bomb of mass destruction is the phrase that President Zelensky has been using. And there was a National Security and Defense Council meeting in Ukraine earlier today where members were briefed that 150 tons of machine oil had made its way into the Dnipro River as a result of this disaster. And there's a risk of another 300 tons of machine oil leaking into the river. So you can just imagine what that means for all of the hundreds of thousands of people who rely on that river for their their drinking water. And as you point out, the blame game is in full swing right now, with Ukraine saying this was clearly Russia that blew this up using mines, the Russians claiming that it was actually shelling by Ukraine that led to this dam collapsing. But interestingly, early in the reporting of this, the Russian state news agencies were actually suggesting that perhaps the dam had actually just collapsed due to previous damage, previous destruction of it earlier in the war. So you can see the changing narratives from the Russian side as we're learning more and more about what happened earlier today.
What about this idea? What are the chances we could see intelligence declassified by Biden administration officials as this sort of search to figure out a motive, anything more definitive comes up? And how might this affect the planned counteroffensive that we know Ukraine has been wanting to do?
Yeah, it's a huge priority right now for the U.S. intelligence community, for international intelligence agencies to try to be able to more definitively point the finger at Russia if and when they can actually do that. They don't want to get ahead of themselves and put out information or speculation that turns out not to be correct. But the stakes here are huge because of what this could mean for Ukraine's promised counteroffensive. And while President Zelensky is saying that the collapse of this dam is not going to impede Ukraine's ability to deoccupy territory held by Russia, you have to remember the Dnipro is basically the dividing line in southern Ukraine between Russian-held territory, Ukrainian-held territory. So this collapse has huge ramifications for Ukraine's ability to try to reclaim that territory that was seized earlier in the war by Russia.
Josh Letterman watching all the developments for us tonight. Josh, thank you very much. A sports bombshell now with the PGA Tour agreeing tonight to merge with LIV Golf, the PGA's big upstart competitor. They're backed by the Saudis. This is a shocking and controversial twist because, remember, LIV was suing the PGA Tour to the tune of millions of dollars, basically saying, hey, PGA, you don't get to have a monopoly on the golf world. LIV had enticed these big deal, big name players over to its tournament, guys like Phil Mickelson, Brooks Koepka, Dustin Johnson, paying a lot of money. So the PGA retaliates, right? They ban these LIV players from joining PGA events. There's also the Saudi factor here. Concerns from 9/11 families, some of them about so-called sports washing. They think the Saudis were trying to use golf to try to improve its reputation related to human rights abuses. Here's PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan last year. You're going to listen to him calling out guys who decided to play for and get paid for by LIV Golf. Listen.
And I would ask, any player that has left or any player that would ever consider leaving, have you ever had to apologize for being a member of the PGA Tour?
So you can imagine that this merger announcement today has been a shocker, enraging some of those 9/11 families who say they've been betrayed. In fact, that's exactly what Terry Strada, who's representative for one group of families, told me just a couple minutes ago.
He had all these golfers standing with him, taking that pledge to stay with the PGA, and then he does this 180 and just sells everyone out and turns his back. He betrays the 9/11 community. He turns his back on his players, on his fans. And I don't understand why or how it happened, and I'm shocked, and we're deeply offended.
Deeply offended, she says. I want to bring in Miguel Almaguer, who is covering this for us now, live from out in L.A. So, Miguel, what is the question on why, right? Why is the PGA doing this? One of the things that critics of this merger have suggested is perhaps it's about the money here.
Well, Hallie, one would certainly imagine that money is a motivating factor, but that's not the reason the PGA is giving, at least publicly, for their compelling source for merging with their biggest rival. To be clear, this came as a massive shock, not just to golfers, but the entire sporting world and beyond. LIV and the PGA, as you pointed out, have been entangled in litigation, but now the PGA commissioner is saying the new tour is, quote, committed to securing and driving the game's future. Here's what he said on CNBC earlier today.
There's been a lot of tension in our sport over the last couple of years, but what we're talking about today is coming together to unify the game of golf and to do so under one umbrella. We've recognized that together we can have a far greater impact on this game than we can working apart.
So the official reasoning there, Hallie, obviously they're trying to unify the sport. We should also point out that the PGA is set to get billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia for this merger.
And that is part of what is raising so much concern from critics of this move. Terry Strada, for example, and others, these 9/11 families, who cite this issue of sports washing, essentially saying that the Saudis are trying to pay their way out of a bad reputation when it relates to human rights abuses here. It is such a big deal that, Miguel, where I am here in Washington, the White House was asked specifically about this. I want to play what the press secretary had to say.
When it comes to human rights, as we have said over and over again, this is something that the president has been very clear about and has brought that up with leaders that he's met with. And so that is never anything that we shy away from. But on this particular merger, we're just not going to comment from here.
Miguel, did the PGA have anything to say today about the Saudi factor here?
They did not. And as you mentioned, LIV obviously comes with controversy. It's backed and funded, as mentioned, by Saudi Arabia. The country, as you also said, has been accused of trying to do just what you explained, sports washing its reputation clean. Of course, Saudi Arabia has been accused of human rights violations. And you heard from that 9/11 family member who was outraged that the the sports organization would be partnering with LIV. Those 9/11 families are calling for an inquiry from the federal government, Hallie.
Is this a done deal? In other words, is it T's crossed, I's dotted, or are there still steps to take before this gets finalized? And what about the actual game itself, right? Because LIV Golf and the PGA, it's golf, so they're obviously similar, but there are some differences between the two.
Yeah, not officially a done deal, but it certainly seems to be an agreement, and they obviously feel very comfortable moving forward. There's been so many unknown here in terms of the game. The tours have different formats. Some are focused on single players, others are focused on team events. Even the name of the tour is unclear, and the PGA and LIV play different number of holes in their games. So what this is going to look like is totally unclear, but we should get those answers in the coming weeks, if not months, Hallie.
Miguel Almaguer, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. So listen, sometime in the next hour, we're going to see Christie officially kick off his 2024 presidential run, making this Republican field a little bit bigger. It is a Republican field looking to essentially knock the crown off the head of the current king of the GOP, and that is former President Donald Trump. When you look at polling, when you look at where he stands with the Republican base, in just the last couple of hours, we've seen Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, file all the paperwork to make it officially official. And from the indications that our team's getting from his team, unseating Donald Trump is pretty much game, set, match for Christie. He's going to go after Donald Trump hard on the campaign trail. He's making his case to voters in New Hampshire tonight. Is the Trump team super worried? Well, look at what the former president is posting, saying he's got to put guys like Christie and other Republicans who don't like him in their place. And the broader Trump orbit seems to agree. A super PAC aligned with him isn't even going after Christie. Instead, turning the conversation around to Ron DeSantis, right? Saying, oh, Christie is going to waste no time eating Ron DeSantis' lunch. Shaq Brewster is in Manchester, New Hampshire, where Christie is set to announce his run in just under 90 minutes from now. We will have coverage, obviously, right here on NBC News Now. It is an interesting look at the mindset here. You've got Christie looking squarely at Donald Trump, right? Aiming his arrows at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is aiming his arrows at Ron DeSantis, even with the Christie announcement here. It says a lot about where the party is at this moment here.
Absolutely. And when you listen to Governor Christie, even when he was here in New Hampshire back in March, when he was teasing this presidential run, he gave a sense of why he's taking this strategy. He said that he made a strategic error back in 2016 when you had much of the field try to avoid Trump, act like he wasn't there instead of taking him on directly. Hallie, that will not be the case this time around. Governor Christie already teasing different ways he's going to go after the former president and suggesting that despite him being an ally, someone who supported him in 2016, helped with his transition, advised him while he was in the White House, even played the role of Joe Biden in debate prep in 2020. He said election night 2020 was when something fundamentally changed with his support. Listen to how he put it to voters when pressed on it back in March.
When you put yourself ahead of our democracy as President of the United States, it's over. I'm sorry. Nothing is bigger. We are the party of me right now. It's about him and nothing else.
So you can expect to hear that same messaging tonight when he officially launches his campaign. It'll be a town hall style event, something that I know you've seen Christie do back in 2016, something he's familiar with. So he'll engage with voters, and you can expect that question to come up about how aggressive he will be against the former president, because it has come up from New Hampshire voters to him before.
Let me put it in shopping terms, perhaps. Who is the Christie customer here, Shaq? Because if you look at some of the favorability numbers for Christie, he's underwater, right? More so than most of the other Republican candidates polled by Monmouth here. And as you know, like, it's not just like it's a Christie, Donald Trump matchup. There's a whole bunch of other people in the race, officially and unofficially. So that brings me back, right? Who's the customer he's going for that's going to get him above the threshold to actually get the nomination? Or for Christie, is it simply about piercing enough arrows into Donald Trump here?
Well, you know, as the campaign is in conversations I've had with them, as they put it to me, if you want to be the nominee, you need to take down Donald Trump. You need to get through Donald Trump. So that gives you a sense of that path and why that's the focus. But there is an affirmative message that you've heard from Christie teasing to folks as he was teasing this presidential campaign. He said he wants to be a change, not just for the country, but for his Republican Party. He says that he wants to get away from what he calls the grievance politics. He wants to shift away from the culture wars and have a campaign that looks more like a traditional Republican, at least what that used to look like before Donald Trump. You know, one thing that he told voters at that town hall back in March, he said, I want to have hope over anger. He said, I don't want to hear about people being angry anymore. So there is that positive message that he's trying to make to voters, that appeal he's trying to give to voters. But you mentioned he has a lot of room to make up. Not only does he have those low favorability ratings among Republicans, but if you look at national polling, he's polling at just about 1%. Yes, it's a lot of time. He'll have a lot of these voter interactions, but he has a lot of ground to cover here, Hallie.
Shaq Brewster will be checking back in with you in just about an hour and change or so when the announcement gets official from Christie. Appreciate it. Right now, about 100 million people around the country are looking at some pretty bad weather, very bad air quality, smoke from those wildfires in Canada, drifting over the border down to Americans. Look at this, really hazy. The New York City skyline there, upstate New York, Boston, Minnesota. There's some people who can even smell the smoke. You can see where all of these air quality alerts are in effect in some of these big cities. Look at all that red and purple there in the Northeast. That means it's unhealthy for everyone, so don't do a whole bunch of things outside. Those fires up in Canada, they are still roaring. More than 400 of them, half of those out of control. I want to bring in Emily Aketa out in New York City here. Emily, obviously an air quality issue today, making headlines everywhere, not just where you are, but in the region.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And this is how an environmental expert kind of put it to me. When you think about you're sitting next to a campfire, for instance, and the smell of the fire, the smoke, it sticks to your clothes. It lingers. Well, essentially, we're seeing the same thing happen, except you're inhaling those particles and they're sticking to your lungs and sometimes other essential organs. And so that can result in symptoms, a variety of symptoms, watery eyes, maybe it's a tickle in your throat, some cases, even difficulty breathing, especially for the more at-risk groups. Think children, seniors, and in particular, those with respiratory conditions like asthma. And so for that reason, experts are encouraging people, if you are in an area with poor air quality, to spend less time outside, especially avoid doing strenuous activity outside. Think about when you're heavily breathing from doing some kind of cardio activity, you're inhaling more of those particulates. And so you're seeing behind me right now in New York City kind of a haziness, a bit of a blur. And that's as a result of, as you mentioned, more than 400 wildfires currently burning in our northern neighbor in Canada. And federal officials there described it as one of the worst starts to the wildfire season on record. To put that into perspective, already more than 9 million acres have burned in Canada. Here in the U.S., we're looking at roughly 500,000 acres. And so that smoke is drifting down, traveling hundreds of miles as far south as the Carolinas. So we spoke with some folks about how it's impacting them. Take a listen here.
It was real hazy flying here. We could, even flying out of O'Hare, we could barely see the downtown Chicago area.
The pilot was saying to look out for the Empire State Building and such, and the Statue of Liberty, and so we're looking out, but it was just looked very hazy. You couldn't really see very much.
And And over a large swath of the U.S., we could see the threat of poor air quality linger throughout the week as the fires in Canada continue to burn. But also keep in mind that there is a critical fire risk for parts of New Jersey and the Philadelphia area. So we could see a bit of a 1-2 punch when we start seeing some domestic wildfires break out as well, Hallie.
Emily Aketa, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Back here in Washington, the special counsel in charge of that big investigation into former President Donald Trump's mishandling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, well, he was spotted by one of our team members. Didn't answer the big question on everybody's minds, if and when Donald Trump may face federal charges. Let me show you here. That's Jack Smith. That was him in a picture. Here he is. Our producer, Gary Grumbach, was like, sir, you know, any federal charges, could those come? Could this investigation wrap up anytime soon? No response. Obviously, if this thing is still very active, it's coming just 24 hours after Smith met with 3 of Mr. Trump's attorneys at the Justice Department. Remember, this case is all about whether or not Mr. Trump took hundreds of classified documents back to Mar-a-Lago, and if he got in the government's way when they tried to get those documents back, right? Did he knowingly take those documents, knowing that he shouldn't have? It comes as we're just learning a grand jury in Florida, of course, where Mar-a-Lago is going to hear witness testimony sometime this week, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. That is maybe a big deal, raising a lot of questions. How does the Florida grand jury affect the other one back here in D.C. that's also heard witness testimony in this case? And why would prosecutors want 2 separate grand juries in 2 different places? I want to bring in Ken Delaney to break this down. Can you answer that question for us, Ken? Do we know, in theory, why there would be 2 grand juries in 2 different places?
I can cite you the range of possibilities, Hallie, and I just want to tell you in the last few minutes, the New York Times has moved a story, not confirmed by NBC News, but important reporting that sheds a little more light on what's going on with that grand jury down in Florida. The Times is reporting that 20 or so Secret Service agents who worked at Mar-a-Lago have testified before that grand jury in the last month. So that grand jury has been working, taking some testimony. It may just be a convenience issue that, you know, they need a grand jury down there for people who can't get up to Washington. Although I'm told that they've made some demands on some people to get them to fly up to Washington to testify before the grand jury up here. So that it may be more complicated than that. Look, the one possibility, perhaps the most extreme, is that Jack Smith, who you saw scowling at our Gary Grumbach in that video, and but believe me, by all accounts, that is his personality. He is a determined man. That he's decided to bring this case in the Southern District of Florida instead of in Washington for legal reasons, potential venue reasons. Most of the conduct happened down there. And prosecutors that I've talked to disagree about how easy it would be to just bring it up in D.C. Some prosecutors say we can get venue anywhere. We're federal prosecutors. Others say, no, it'd be cleaner down in Florida. Certainly the jury pool would be more sympathetic, presumably, in very democratic, liberal Washington, D.C. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is there's a particular person, possibly Walt Nauta, the butler, the body man who moved documents around, who may be getting charged with a false statements case, lying to federal investigators, which has to happen down in Florida because he was interviewed down there. Another possibility is they charge Trump both in Washington and Florida for particular legal reasons. We just don't know. But here's what we do know. A year after the Justice Department came down to Mar-a-Lago and urged Donald Trump and his lawyers to give back all the classified documents, this investigation appears to be reaching a conclusion. And most people I talk to, whether they represent witnesses in the case or they're outside legal experts, believe that Donald Trump will be charged, Hallie.
And timeline-wise, Ken, because that is one of the big questions, and you're alluding to that here, right? The idea that perhaps, reading the tea leaves, it looks like we're close to wrapping up. Where are we with that? Would it be simultaneous if it is 2 grand juries? Could we see one then the other? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, all I can tell you is, you know how this works in Washington, Hallie.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of signals from sources that the next 2 weeks are critical. That, don't take any time off over the next 2 weeks. Could something happen first in Florida, then in Washington? Very possible. Could it all happen at once, or could it all happen in Florida? I'm not sure about that, but I do believe that something is going to happen in the next 2 weeks. We're going to see a lot of action here.
Ken Delaney, and canceling all of your vacation days for the month of June. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Overseas now, Prince Harry says today tabloid editor and journalists have blood on their hands. They have blood on their hands, he says, because of the lengths they went to try to get scoops on him and his family. It's the first testimony given by a senior royal in more than a century. It was a big deal, which is why there was a big crowd. Look at that. Dozens of TV cameras, photographers, security, obviously, crowds of people behind those barricades trying to get a peek. Here he is. Harry's about to get out of this car. He shows up, gets out. case Harry's making is against the Mirror Group newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mirror tabloid. He says they got personal info on him by doing things that broke the law. He says they hacked his phone, etc. Taking a stand today, he says people working for these tabs are responsible for a lot of pain, upset, and in some cases, he says, death. Megan Fitzgerald has more.
Good to be with you. Look, what we saw today was a defensive Prince Harry. This is certainly as suspected. In speaking with legal experts, they suspected that the attorney for MGN would go after Harry's credibility. And that's most certainly what we saw this morning, really practically right off the bat. Now, there are 33 articles that are in question that Prince Harry alleges were able to be written by obtaining information unlawfully. And so we saw this morning the attorney for MGN, Andrew Green, asking Prince Harry if he actually read all 33 of those articles, to which Prince Harry responded he couldn't remember. So then, of course, that opens the door for the attorney, Mr. Green, to ask, well, then how is it that these articles impacted you so much if you don't even remember them? And Prince Harry then went on to say that every single article written about him caused him distress. We heard from the attorney really honing in on Prince Harry and asking him, well, what evidence do you have to suggest that these articles were written unlawfully? And Prince Harry pushed back and said, look, that's a question that you're going to have to ask the journalists who wrote them. And he also went on to say that, he's a witness and it's not his job to really deconstruct those articles. It was certainly a difficult day for Prince Harry. He will be back again tomorrow. The judge tells us that he suspects Prince Harry's cross-examination should end by midday, but then his attorney wants the opportunity to question him. So we know that there's at least one full day left of testimony from Prince Harry before this trial moves forward. Back to you.
Our thanks to Megan Fitzgerald for that reporting. Coming up here on the show, an earthquake hitting Haiti right after devastating floods. We've got to look at the damage. You see some of it there in the 5 things. Plus, Wall Street's biggest watchdog is suing one of the biggest crypto exchanges. So what does the crackdown mean for people who care about crypto's future? We're getting into it. If you are one of the millions of Americans flying somewhere in the next few months, you'll want to listen to the 5 things because it's all about airports that could have it the worst this summer. But before we get to that, we want to get into the new crypto crackdown, it seems, from the feds as they are suing one of the country's biggest crypto exchanges. It's a new filing out of New York by the Securities and Exchange Commission that accuses Coinbase of, I'll say it in their words, defying the government's regulatory structures and evading disclosure requirements. In plain English, they're basically saying Coinbase is breaking the law by ignoring what the government says they need to do and that they're not protecting the people investing with them. This is coming, by the way, not even 24 hours after the SEC sued Coinbase's biggest rival, Binance, and its founder. No evidence that those two actions are connected here at this point, but it does speak to where we are in this current moment. Coinbase, in a new statement, is accusing the SEC of hurting America's economic competitiveness. They're saying, hey, it's going to be business as usual for a bit. Brian Chung is joining us now. So what does this mean, Brian? Is this a new world order for crypto companies here?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a watershed moment for the regulatory structure around what has largely been an unregulated industry, which is cryptocurrencies. Now, when we talk about what the SEC is alleging, again, these are 2 separate complaints against 2 separate companies, but they are both exchanges. So Coinbase failing to register as a broker and exchange, improperly offering crypto asset securities, making billions while depriving investors of protections. Whereas with Binance, there are 13 complaints, actually. One of them is failing to register as a broker and exchange as well, but they also allege that they mishandled customer funds and lied to American regulators and investors, a.k.a. fraud. Now, broadly speaking, this shows the posturing from the SEC that they feel that a lot of illegal activity is happening on both of these exchanges. Now, here's what SEC Chair Gary Gensler has said specifically about Coinbase, which was lodged earlier this morning. He said, quote, "We allege that Coinbase, despite being subject to the securities laws, commingled and unlawfully offered exchange, broker-dealer, and clearinghouse functions. Translation, Coinbase was not doing what it was supposed to do, needed to regulate with the SEC, but did not do so." Now, those on the other side of the coin have said, well, the SEC never outlined exactly how we're supposed to play in the regulated space. A little bit of he said, she said, but either way, you see who has the leverage here, the government cracking down on this industry.
You know, and there is that philosophical question, if you regulate crypto, like, can it still be crypto? You look at some of the commercials, right? Advertising was a huge part of this. We've seen, like, celebrities, for example, for FTX. That's a whole other thing. Coinbase really tried to focus on the trust piece of it. I'm going to play a little bit. They put a slogan at the end of their ads to urge people to, in their words, block out the noise. Watch. You see it there, right? Coinbase, the most trusted crypto exchange. That was their whole pitch, was that emphasis on safety. The SEC says ads like that are part of the problem. They say the millions spent on advertising is part of how they try to get around regulations.
Yeah, well, the challenge here is that Coinbase took a very different ad approach to FTX, where they had Larry David and Shaquille O'Neal doing promotions for them. But broadly speaking, they are both doing a lot of advertising. It costs them a lot of money to make that ad to Coinbase. Now, for what's worth, again, these are two different lawsuits. Coinbase and Binance are both cryptocurrency exchanges. Experts that I've spoken to have said that the case for Coinbase might not be as bad as the case for Binance, where there's more substantial allegations of commingling the funds, a.k.a. using the money that people put in the assets that people hold on Binance for reasons that those users are not aware of. But look, at the end of the day, the advertising is the reason why Coinbase and Binance are the two largest cryptocurrency exchanges out there, which makes it that much more notable that the SEC decided to go after them, because they're really, especially as the exchanges in this community, really the heart of the cryptocurrency industry.
Brian Chung, thank you very much for that. Appreciate the crypto breakdown for us tonight. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, at least 4 people are dead after an earthquake in Haiti today, 4.9 magnitude. You're looking at some of the damage here. Some homes collapsed near the epicenter. It was on the southwest coast of the country. Several kids are being treated at local hospitals, and it's all happening as Haiti is just starting to recover from all of that flooding over the weekend, which is being blamed for more than 50 deaths. Number 2, Merck is suing the government here. The company says having to negotiate drug prices for Medicare at below market rates is unconstitutional. They say that violates the First and Fifth Amendments. This is tied to a provision of the Inflation Reduction Act, that big bill that President Biden and Democrats wanted to get through Congress. The pharma industry says losing profit means they won't be able to develop as many new treatments. Number 3, a popular infant pillow is now linked to at least 10 deaths since 2015. 3 million Boppy newborn loungers were recalled in 2021 after several babies suffocated. At least 2 deaths were reported after the recall. The maker and regulators are again asking parents to stop using this right away. An NBC News investigation published last month found that at least 26 babies died in accidents involving infant loungers since 2015. Number 4, singer Susan Boyle, you might remember from Britain's Got Talent, says a minor stroke has affected how she can sing. She shared the news during a surprise appearance on the show. She had a stroke back in April of 2022. She was a viral sensation, remember. She says she's fought like crazy to try to get back on stage. Number 5, if you're flying into or out of Chicago in the next few months, build in some extra time, perhaps. The travel app Hopper says it's going to be the worst airport for travel this summer. 44% of flights there had some kind of disruption next year. If you're wondering where else could get a little bit messy, look for Baltimore, Newark, Dallas, and JFK in New York. So listen, gas stoves lighting a bit of a political fire. Ugh. I'm sorry I'm a hack, but it's true, right? I mean, that is what's happening in the House of Representatives today. You have 11 House conservatives taking the rare step of joining every Democrat to block a couple of Republican bills meant to protect gas stoves. It's basically to try to show how angry they are over how House Speaker Kevin McCarthy cut this debt ceiling deal, I should say, the deal to let the U.S. government pay its bills on time with President Biden. We've been talking about how state and local officials some of them have banned some of these stoves in some new buildings. That created a bit of a political firestorm, even though regulators said, we don't plan to ban gas stoves. They have no intention, they say, to do this. Also, these House bills would never pass the Senate. Sahil Kapoor is joining us now. Sahil, talk us through this, right? Because it seems like this is less a story about gas stoves and more a story about political posturing. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair, Hallie. It's extremely unusual for a rule vote, which I should say is a procedural vote, to tee up votes on certain bills, to get voted down on the floor of the House by members of the majority. Usually the majority party carries it through. But in this case, 7 Republicans voted with all Democrats to take down this rule. This last happened in 2002. It's so unusual it hasn't happened even once in the last 2 decades. And yes, it is in large part about these ultra-conservative Republicans acting out against Speaker McCarthy. McCarthy and his leadership team for what they perceive is a bad debt ceiling deal cut with President Biden and with Democrats to avert default. But there was another element to this as well. Some of them said that they were standing with Congressman Andrew Clyde, who is also a hard-right Republican after a feud he apparently had with House Republican leadership. In this telling, Clyde was told that his bill to repeal a gun regulation involving pistols by President Biden's ATF would not come up because Clyde was one of the Republicans who voted against the rule on the debt limit. They said that was part of the reason. Now, that part apparently has been resolved. You see the new tweet here by Congressman Clyde saying House GOP leadership just confirmed their resolution to block that ATF rule and that it will come to a vote next Tuesday. He says he'll hold them to this promise. So in theory, Hallie, one of the hurdles here has been lifted. And if some of those 11, all but 4 of them at least, will flip, then House Republicans can bring these gas stove bills up to the floor after all at a later date.
Sahil Kapoor, we'll see. Thank you very much. Live for us on Capitol Hill. Appreciate it. When we come back, hundreds of thousands of protesters out demonstrating across France today. Some of them even storming the headquarters of the Paris Olympics. We'll explain why and what's next as we take you live to the ground next. Things are somewhat calm in France tonight after a scene that was frankly anything but, with hundreds of thousands of people showing up to protest a law that's been making headlines for months now. The retirement age was raised by 2 years. Protesters are not at all happy about it. You can see some of the scenes here. People setting trucks and dumpsters on fire, like actual dumpster fires in the middle of the streets. Police were in riot gear. They tried to use tear gas to get people to disperse. Some 11,000 police officers ended up sent out, including 4,000 in Paris alone. Just the latest in a bunch of protests there over this retirement law. Matt Bradley joins us now from Paris. Are these protests different from what we saw before this law was passed?
No, not really, Hallie. And, you know, the only thing that really made them different is that they're actually quite a bit smaller. They're about half the size of the peak level of protests that we've seen in the past couple of months. And, you know, all of that violence you just mentioned, the burning, the police scuffles, you know, all of that is actually what makes this typical rather than atypical. But the one thing that we're seeing here that was interesting is that a lot of the protesters are looking forward to Thursday, day after tomorrow, and that's when they're expecting a new law to be introduced into Parliament, the National Assembly here in France, that would reverse that law that was just passed back in April, that's already been published in the official Gazette here in France, that really promulgates that move, raising the age of retirement by 2 years. So in many ways, this was kind of a desperate last-ditch effort to try to push legislators to try to reverse that law. And it's something that, you know, we talked to some people, you know, they said that there's still hope, even though there doesn't sound like there's going to be hope. You know, they can, but the Parliament is saying, and a lot of the leaders in Parliament are saying that they're going to block it, that they're going to kind of just snuff this out before it even starts on Thursday. I spoke with one of the protesters. Here's what she told me.
It's no finish. I mean, next day will be a very important fight in our assembly. And this manifestation is part of this fight in order to rehab or take it our rights.
So, as you can see, people are hoping that this is actually going to work. But your question, can they actually do that? Well, you know, a lot of the constitutional rules, a lot of the legislative rules here in France, they say they can't. They say they might not even be able to put that legislation on the floor so that it could even be discussed. So in many ways, this effort to try to reverse the previous rule, it's kind of been stillborn already.
Matt Bradley, live for us there in Paris. Matt, thank you very much. Thanks for being out there for us tonight. Coming up here on the show, a super rare sighting in Yosemite that had people going, what? What is this? We'll explain in the local. Tonight, calls for the arrest of a woman accused of killing her neighbor by firing at her through her front door. Still a lot of questions about what happened, but here's what we can put together so far. The lawyer for the family of the victim, Ben Crump, high-profile attorney, says that A.J. Owen's family, her kids, were playing in a field in Ocala when an unidentified white woman began yelling at them to get off her land. Apparently called them racial slurs, he says. Crump says the woman took some kind of iPad or tablet that the kids left there. And when one of them went back for it, she threw something and hit the child. Owens then went to speak to the neighbor. Crump says she knocked on the door at that point and was allegedly shot through the door. Now, what are police saying? They're not confirming or rejecting what Crump says. They simply say there had been a neighborhood feud between the alleged shooter and Owens about her kids. Lindsay Reiser is joining us now. So still some question marks here around, obviously, the situation and what happened. Tell us more about the details that we do know and where this goes next.
So, Hallie, police are saying that there was an ongoing feud between Ajika A.J. Owens and this neighbor. There had been some 6 to 8 incidents in the past in which police had been called out. And while you mentioned they're not disputing Benjamin Crump or the family's version of events that happened on Friday, they are saying that this started with a dispute with the children, between the children and the neighbor. So according to civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who's representing the family right now, Owens' children were playing in a field near an apartment or duplex complex when this 58-year-old white woman yelled at them to get off her property and allegedly, according to Crump and the family, called them racial slurs. The children ran away, but they forgot an iPad or a tablet of some sort. So one of the children went to the neighbor's home to try and retrieve it. That is when Crump and Owens' family say that that neighbor threw something either at or directed toward the child, which police say was a pair of skates, struck the child, and the child went home to tell his mother, A.J. Owens. Owens came to talk to the neighbor, and that is when, according to police who have interviewed the shooter, things got very tense. It was a heated exchange. Both sides were being very aggressive. There was banging on the door or wall. There were threats being made. Ultimately, while Owens' family says that door never opened, that neighbor shot through the door, striking Owens and ultimately killing her. And police say 2 of her 4 children were witnesses to this. Officers responded. It had essentially been a trespassing call. And by the time they got there, she was already wounded and she was pronounced deceased at the hospital. Now, this neighbor has not been charged or anything of the like, has not been arrested. And so there are calls right now to do so, but the sheriff's office is asking everybody to not jump to any conclusions.
How does Florida stand your ground law come into play in this case?
So, Hallie, this is something, obviously, that we have covered and we have heard about other cases in which this comes into play. The sheriff's office is saying if there is even a hint of a stand-your-ground element to this, then they cannot make an immediate arrest, according to the law that they have there in Florida. So they have to investigate and find out whether the deadly force was justified or not. So they say that this neighbor is cooperating, and of course, Owens' family completely distraught. They say she was a loving mother. She was a football and cheerleading mother. She was a manager in a restaurant industry. The sheriff's office also says that they are waiting, Hallie, to interview the children who witnessed this, and obviously they're very traumatized, and so they're waiting a little bit to do so, Hallie.
Lindsay Reiser, thank you very much. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Western Bureau, something rare in Yosemite. Look at this. You see that? That's a wolverine. That's only the 2nd time a wolverine's been spotted in that state in about 100 years. According to wildlife officials, wolverines are considered a threatened species out in California. They haven't really been there since the 1920s. The state's Department of Fish and Wildlife plans to track that wolverine, see where it goes. Out of our Northeast Bureau, retired New York City handyman is a few $1 million richer, getting the 13th biggest jackpot in Mega Millions history. He's 71, and he already knows what he wants to do with his big payout. Now he wants to travel, get a new house, get a new car, and donate to his church. He says he's taking the lump sum. He'll walk away with about $157 million after taxes. And out of our Western Bureau, for 1 week and 1 week only, people driving in Joshua Tree can take a snack break at a rest stop with a Cheez-It theme. The Kellogg Company is rolling this out, saying it's the world's first and only Cheez-It pump. It is what it sounds like, folks. It literally just pumps bags of Cheez-Its directly into your car. There's some merch. There's some interesting flavors. If you're out there, it's open through Sunday. It's free. Let us know how it goes. Still to come here on the show. Actors may be joining writers going on strike soon. We'll talk about what the negotiations tomorrow could mean for the future of your favorite shows. So you've heard about the writer's strike in Hollywood. Well, now it's the actors voting to strike, too. If they can't get to an agreement with studios when their own negotiations start tomorrow, This would be a huge deal if they do strike. The first time we've seen that for TV and movie actors since 1980, when Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back was the #1 film. 16,000 actors, all part of SAG-AFTRA, could hit the picket line. Their contract is up at the end of this month, so the clock is ticking. What do they want? What's on the table? They want more money for their work that goes on streaming. They want more protections against AI. They want some more rules around auditions that they have to tape themselves. The chief negotiator for the union says the vote is, I'm quoting here, a clear statement that it's time for an evolution in this contract. Let's bring in Dana Griffin with more. Okay, fine. Question is, writers are already striking. If the actors do strike, what does it mean for the shows and the movies people like to watch? Does that all stop production? How do they go on?
That is the big question. We're not sure if this turns into a strike. Could this halt potential productions that are already filming right now? We don't know. But knowing that the writers are currently on strike, you can possibly hear the honking going on because they're right near our studios here in Universal City. Because they are currently on strike now, just adding to that picket line may not change much, because we talked about this before. When there's no writers, there are no scripted series. When there's no actors, there's no production. So this could put more pressure on Hollywood to try to reach some sort of deal. But the thing is, SAG-AFTRA, they have several concerns. You mentioned some of them. They want to bolster their pensions. They want to make sure they have protection over the advancement of AI. They're not fully against using AI because they recognize that it could help streamline some things. But the actors want to protect their likeness, their voice, their image, so that companies can't take that from them and use it. They want to kind of copyright their likeness so that they can be protected. And obviously, they want higher wages. They feel like they've been really stifled by not only the pandemic, but inflation, also streaming, because they feel like those residuals are not paying as much as they used to. We have a statement that I actually want to pull up. This is from Duncan Crabtree Ireland. He is the National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator for SAG-AFTRA. He wrote in an op-ed for Variety saying that we are approaching these negotiations with the goal of achieving a new agreement that is beneficial to SAG-AFTRA members and the industry overall. And actually, that came from the Alliance, the AMPTP. But for Ireland, he said that the SAG-AFTRA isn't afraid of new technology, new ways of doing things. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think, Hallie, that pretty much sums it up for you.
Talk about the pressure on the studios here, right? Because they've got writers striking already. If the actors do go on strike, does that sort of turn up the temperature for them?
Absolutely, because now you've got a series of two different unions that are now on the picket lines. They're drawing more attention. People are watching this from afar, and customers are going to want to say, hey, I want to see new scripted television. I want to see new films. And if these, entertainers, writers, directors, are out of the mix, it really hits this industry hard. Now, on the flip side, the Directors Guild actually came to a tentative agreement, and the Writers Guild, they are showing support, and they're glad that, the directors got some sort of deal. But they also commented that our bargaining position remained the same as they were May 1st, 2023, signaling that their negotiations have possibly stalled here. The AMPTP will not be able to negotiate a deal for writers with anyone else. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as the new negotiations start for the actors tomorrow, and what happens, if anything, Hallie, here in Hollywood.
Dana Griffin live for us in L.A., where we sure can hear the honking. And I know, because we've seen it, those folks picketing behind you. Appreciate it, Dana. Thanks. That does it for us for this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now. We are coming on the air with a big announcement for Christie. He is just about a half an hour away from getting into the Republican race for the White House. So what is his game plan? Other than rag on Donald Trump, is that it? Will it work? We'll take you live to New Hampshire with more on what we're hearing from his team. Also tonight, some new U.S. intelligence our team's learning about leans toward Russia perhaps being behind the collapse of a huge dam in Ukraine. Water everywhere, thousands of people out of their homes. We'll take you live to Kyiv for the latest. Then a legitimately stunning twist in the sports world. The PGA Tour teaming up with LIV Golf, which is backed by the Saudis, with new accusations now that money beat morality. What one member of a group of 9/11 families is telling me about what she sees as a betrayal just tonight. Plus, the dangerous stuff in the air from the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic coast in the Northeast, drifting in from wildfires in Canada. We'll talk about the dangers and when it could clear up. And the new crypto crackdown on a couple of the biggest players out there. Is it a new world order for that industry now that the government's getting more involved? We'll get into it later on in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and coming up this hour, Christie is going to kick off his run for the presidency officially, making the Republican field of candidates who want to knock the crown off the head of the king of the GOP, Donald Trump, even bigger. We've already seen the former New Jersey governor file all the paperwork, and from what we're hearing from his team, yes, getting Donald Trump off the Republican throne is kind of game, set, match for Christie, who, remember, at one point had endorsed Trump, now not a fan of the former president. Christie plans to go after Mr. Trump hard on the campaign trail, we understand right away, as he's making his case to New Hampshire voters tonight. And he's telegraphed just how he plans to do this for months. Watch.
When you put yourself ahead of our democracy as president of the United States, it's over. I'm sorry. Nothing is bigger. We are the party of me right now. It's about him and nothing else.
Get ready to hear a lot of that, right, in the months to come. The question is it going to resonate, right? Is it going to convince voters that Christie's their guy? In other words, does he have the juice for people voting in the Republican primary? Because the latest polling shows he's not even in the top 8 in the GOP field, right? Again, early days, but this is where the numbers stand right now. Same poll shows he's actually underwater when it comes to his, what they call fave-unfaves, like how many people like him. Look, he's the only one in this group that Republicans dislike more than they like. Numbers like that could explain why Mr. Trump doesn't sound too worried at this point. On Truth Social, he's posting about how he's got to put guys like Christie and other Republicans who don't like him in their place. Donald Trump's broader orbit seems to agree. A super PAC in his camp isn't even criticizing Christie. They're instead turning the conversation to Ron DeSantis, saying Christie is going to eat DeSantis's lunch, basically. Shaq Brewster is live for us in Manchester, New Hampshire. So here we are. Any campaign rollout is obviously a big moment for that particular politician. Christie has done this before. He knows what this is like. You've covered him. I've covered him on the campaign trail before. He hasn't won before. Why does he think this time could be different?
Well, it's because he says that he learned the lesson from 2016, the lesson that he learned in 2016 when he came in 6th place here in New Hampshire, then quickly dropped out and threw his support behind former President Donald Trump, is that he believes he has to take him on early. He has to get out, be aggressive early on. And that is the signal that you've been getting, not just from Governor Christie, but from his campaign, saying that he will draw that contrast with the former president, because you see the position in polling that former President Donald Trump has right now. He's leading the field. You're looking at the actual results from the 2016 race on your screen right now. You see he came in 6th place there with 7%. He knows that he needs to go on the attack early, and you can expect to hear that later today when he makes that formal announcement, Hallie.
Talk to me about like vibe checks in New Hampshire, because you are in New Hampshire and so is Christie for a very specific reason, because he sees this, I would presume, right, as the place where if he's going to make a play, it's going to be there. Fair?
Absolutely the case, Hallie. And, you know, I just was talking to some voters as they were filing into this event here. It's a town hall meeting, so they're going to have the interaction with Christie. They're going to have the opportunity to ask him questions. He's going to be able to push back. We've seen him do this before as he was teasing a presidential run, and some of them have called him out saying, hey, you supported Trump in the past. Why are you shifting positions now? So you'll see that interaction now. But as I was talking with voters, there's a mix of them. Some of them supported him back in 2016. They're excited to see him. Some of them are open to other candidates. They know that they don't want to support President Trump, so they're looking to see at different options who's out there. Others just are kind of speculating. They see the field, they see the slew of candidates that are out there, and they want to see a fighter, and they're trying to see it. In the words of one gentleman I spoke to, they want to see if he will be the best fighter to take on both former President Trump, but then to convince him that he will be able to beat President Biden in the general election. So you have a wide range of people who are here. It'll be interesting to see how Christie makes that interaction with voters who are hearing him out, at least.
Well, it also draws the line, right? Because one thing that he said back at that March town hall that we showed is that there were mistakes made in 2016 when it was a circular firing squad among everybody but Trump. right? So you had like Marco Rubio going after, Carly, whatever. Like you did, instead of the guy who was continuing to poll at the top of the pack. Deja vu here for where we stand for now for 2023. But also Donald Trump retains a grip on the Republican base. It is a fine line that Chris Christie is going to have to walk, especially Chris Christie, because he's not going to be subtle in his attacks on Donald Trump, right, in order to court the Trump base. He's been on Sunday shows for months blasting Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump's been blasting him. Like, it seems like he is going to have a harder time walking and threading that needle, walking that line and threading that needle than other candidates in this race.
Yeah. 100% the case, Hallie. I love that we have that March town hall to reference because we get a sense of what we will likely hear today, and we get a sense of that campaign strategy now. And one thing that he said in that town hall, you mentioned Marco Rubio and that circular firing squad, so to speak. It was Governor Christie who went after Marco Rubio in that debate moment, really taking down his campaign, or at least making it much more difficult for Rubio to succeed. What he has said, what Christie has told voters already, is that he wants to have that moment again that he had against Marco Rubio. He wants to have that aggression and square it at President Trump. He wants to direct those attacks against former President Trump because he says he was with him. This is not someone who was this never Trumper to begin with. He was with him. He supported him in 2016. He helped President Trump prep for a debate against President Biden in 2020. He said that it was the moment, election night 2020, when former President Trump said that that there was election fraud. That was when things really switched and things really changed. And he said that was disqualifying for him. He wants to square his attention at the former president, and that's the main difference than what we saw in 2016.
Taking a live look at that room on the left side of your screen there. Shaq will check back in with you after it is officially official. Thank you very much. Later on this hour. Let's take you overseas because tonight Ukraine and Russia are pointing the finger at each other for blowing up a dam, with multiple sources telling NBC News that new U.S. intelligence leads toward Russia being to blame for what's now a major emergency in southern Ukraine. You can see it here. Tons of water rushing in. Something like 70 towns flooded, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky. Thousands of people who've had to leave their homes as countries on both sides of this invasion, this war, have been scrambling all day to get people somewhere safe, with water levels expected to keep going up tonight. The question is, whose fault is it? Right? Publicly, there's no U.S. official saying anything definitive about whether Russia did it. What they are saying is that the Kremlin has a lot to be blamed for already.
The important thing to remember, though, that it was, in fact, Russia that started this war. It was Russia that was occupying this area, and it was Russia that was in control of the dam.
The reason this is such a big deal is because this dam is in a crucial part of the country. Its reservoir gives water to farmers and people who live in the area. That water also helps cool a nearby nuclear plant controlled by Russia. The Kremlin says this whole disaster isn't on them. They're accusing Ukraine of what they call a terrorist attack. All of it having some echoes of history, with U.S. and Western officials reminding us that 80 years ago, former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin blew up a dam in Ukraine to stop an enemy advance as the Nazis were sweeping through the country. Molly Hunter is joining us now live from Kyiv. Let's start with the essentially disaster part of it. It's been described as an ecological bomb, essentially, right? What is happening to get people what they need to survive and to get through this in the next 24 hours?
Right, Hallie, as we were kind of reaching out to organizations today to figure out kind of the humanitarian response, we've got to remember, of course, exactly where it is. And that map that you had up before really paints a clear picture for our viewers that this is obviously still a war zone, that this dam is actually literally on the front line, on the east bank of that Dnipro River down there. That is the front line, that river. There are Russian troops. And on the western bank, that is where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I should say, civilians who live in Kherson. And those civilians, Hallie, we should also note and remind our audience that they already survived months of brutal Russian occupation, and now they are dealing with catastrophic flooding. So there are a couple of things, according to analysts, that we're really looking for overnight, and you hinted at this in your intro. The water levels are rising. They are rising fast. Now, earlier today, we were given a rate of 6 inches an hour. It has slowed slightly, but we are told that those levels, that water level, will peak overnight. So early morning my time, overnight your time. Those water levels will then stay that way for about 4 to 5 days. That makes rescuing people really, really hard. But we did see a huge effort as the kind of dust settled, as people tried to figure out, kind of comms became a little bit more clear, we saw the ICRC, the Red Cross get in there. We saw local organizations get in there. We know USAID is working with local partners to evacuate people. The numbers we have on the evacuations, Hallie, are just over 1,000 people. So hoping that tomorrow, even if water levels stay high, they're able to start getting more and more people out there, because Ukrainian officials are saying there are tens of thousands of people in kind of the danger zone. And an analyst, Hallie, tells us that 300,000 people, though, tonight will be without drinkable water.
It's incredible to hear, Molly, in a country where people have dealt with so much after this invasion by Russia of Ukraine. You've laid out sort of the disaster urgency piece of it, right? Like getting help to people who need it. Go to the diplomatic piece of it, because there is a blame game happening now between Russia and Ukraine. We've reported here at NBC News that according to 3 officials, 3 sources, there is intelligence that leans toward Russia being behind this, although, again, nobody said anything definitive about it. In fact, we've seen U.S. officials go out of their way to avoid saying anything definitive. Tell us more about what you're hearing from your end and what the sensibility is in Ukraine.
Yeah, Hallie, well, Ukrainian officials, and they have since the wee hours, since very early this morning when the story broke, have been very, very definitive. President Zelensky has called this a terrorist attack. He has called this a war crime. But of course, this attack happens as we've been talking about this Ukrainian counteroffensive. And I do just want to reference 2 statements, one from President Zelensky and one from one of his senior advisors. But let's bring that Zelensky statement up on screen for your audience. Zelensky made it clear tonight, Hallie, and this is his exact quote: "The dam's detonation did not hinder Ukraine's ability to deoccupy its territories." The counteroffensive aimed, of course, at kicking Russian troops off of Ukrainian land that they currently occupy. So he is very clearly saying that this didn't thwart our attempts. We didn't plan anything that this kind of cut off, because there's a sense that Ukrainian officials thought Russia was really trying to cut off that southern route for Ukrainian troops. There's another tweet that I just saw. Senior Zelensky advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, Hallie, he said the purpose is obvious: to create insurmountable obstacles in the way of advancing Ukrainian armed forces. So the perspective from Kyiv is very, very clear, Hallie.
Molly Hunter, live for us in Kyiv. Molly, thank you for being with us. Thanks for doing that important work out in Ukraine. Appreciate it. To a sports bombshell now, with the PGA Tour now agreeing tonight to merge with LIV Golf. That's the PGA's big upstart competitor that's backed by the Saudis. In just the last couple of minutes, we've seen the PGA Commissioner, Jay Monahan, taking questions from reporters after meeting with players. Monahan described the players' meeting as intense and heated. That is probably not a shock to you, because this whole thing has been a shock. It is a controversial twist, because remember, LIV was suing the PGA Tour to the tune of millions of dollars, basically saying, hey, PGA, you don't get to have a monopoly on the golf world. LIV had enticed these big deal, big name players over to its tournament, guys like Phil Mickelson, Brooks Koepka, Dustin Johnson, paying a lot of money, so the PGA retaliates. They ban these LIV players from joining PGA events. There's also the Saudi factor here, concerns from some 9/11 families about so-called sports washing. They think the Saudis were trying to use golf to try to improve its reputation related to human rights abuses. Let me play for you what Monahan said last year, right? You're going to listen to him calling out guys who decided to play for and get paid by LIV Golf.
And I would ask, any player that has left, or any player that would ever consider leaving, have you ever had to apologize for being a member of the PGA Tour?
Monahan also saying late today he recognizes people will call him a hypocrite. He says circumstances change. 9/11 families probably not buying that. They say they've been betrayed. That's exactly what Terry Strada, who's a representative for one group of families, told me not too long ago.
He had all these golfers standing with him, taking that pledge to stay with the PGA. And then he does this 180 and just sells everyone out and turns his back. He betrays the 9/11 community. He turns his back on his players, on his fans. And I don't understand why or how it happened. And I'm shocked, and we're deeply offended.
Let me play for you what Jay Monahan had to say. Listen. So, Miguel, what is the question on why, right? Why is the PGA doing this? One of the things that critics of this merger have suggested is perhaps it's about the money here.
Well, Hallie, one would certainly imagine that money is a motivating factor, but that's not the reason the PGA is giving, at least publicly, for their compelling source for merging with their biggest rival. To be clear, this came as a massive shock, not just to golfers, but the entire sporting world and beyond. LIV and the PGA, as you pointed out, have been entangled in litigation, but now the PGA commissioner is saying the new tour is, quote, committed to securing and driving the game's future. Here's what he said on CNBC earlier today.
There's been a lot of tension in our sport over the last couple of years, but what we're talking about today is coming together to unify the game of golf and to do so under one umbrella. We've recognized that together we can have a far greater impact on this game than we can working apart.
So the official reasoning there, Hallie, obviously they're trying to unify the sport. We should also point out that the PGA is set to get billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia for this merger.
And that is part of what is raising so much concern from critics of this move. Terry Strada, for example, and others, these 9/11 families who cite this issue of sports washing, essentially saying that the Saudis are trying to pay their way out of a bad reputation when it relates to human rights abuses here. It is such a big deal that, Miguel, where I am here in Washington, the White House was asked specifically about this. I want to play what the press secretary had to say.
When it comes to human rights, as we have said over and over again, this is something that the president has been very clear about and has brought that up with leaders that he's met with. And so that is never anything that we shy away from. But on this particular merger, we're just not going to comment from here.
Miguel, did the PGA have anything to say today about the Saudi factor here?
They did not. And as you mentioned, LIV obviously comes with controversy. It's backed and funded, as mentioned, by Saudi Arabia. The country, as you also said, has been accused of trying to do just what you explained, sports washing its reputation clean. Of course, Saudi Arabia has been accused of human rights violations. And you heard from that 9/11 family member who was outraged that the the sports organization, would be partnering with LIV. Those 9/11 families are calling for an inquiry from the federal government, Hallie.
Is this a done deal? In other words, is it T's crossed, I's dotted, or are there still steps to take before this gets finalized? And what about the actual game itself, right? Because LIV Golf and the PGA, it's golf, so they're obviously similar, but there are some differences between the two.
Yeah, not officially a done deal, but it certainly seems to be an agreement, and they obviously feel very comfortable moving forward. There's been so many unknown here in terms of the game. The tours have different formats. Some are focused on single players. Others are focused on team events. Even the name of the tour is unclear, and the PGA and LIV play different number of holes in their games. So what this is going to look like is totally unclear, but we should get those answers in the coming weeks, if not months, Hallie.
Miguel Almaguer, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Right now, you got about 100 million people all around the country looking at some really bad air quality, mostly because of those wildfires in Canada. It is dangerous at this point. You've got smoke drifting across the border, creating, look at this, all this haze from New York City to upstate New York, out to Boston, Minnesota. Some people can smell it. And look at the map. You see all these air quality alerts in big cities. Look at all that red and purple in the Northeast down to the Mid-Atlantic. That means you can see red and purple, unhealthy or very unhealthy for people. So they're saying, hey, don't do a lot of outdoor activities right now. Those fires up in Canada, they are still roaring. More than 400 of them, more than half of those out of control. I want to bring in Emily Aketa in New York City. And I'm looking behind you, Emily, and I guess it looks a little hazy in New York. The issue, though, is people can really feel it when they breathe. That's creating the concern across the region.
That's right, Hallie. It's not just about what you're seeing, but also what you're smelling. The smell of smoke traveling hundreds of miles from the origin of those wildfires. 65 million people facing air quality alerts from wildfire smoke alone, not to mention an additional 35 million people facing air quality alerts, poor air quality as a result of increased concentration of ozone levels. So think the mixture of pollutants with heat. And this haziness that you're seeing on your screen and what you're seeing behind me, it is transformed warm skies all the way from the Midwest up and down the East Coast into the mid-Atlantic as we continue to see that smoke really dissipate and travel, again, hundreds of miles from those more than 400 wildfires in Canada. And how an environmental expert described the situation to me is, you know, you think about sitting next to a campfire, how that smell of the smoke, the smell of the fire, it sticks to your clothes, it lingers. Well, the same thing is happening here, except you're inhaling the smoke particles and they can stick to your lungs and even more important organs. And so the types of symptoms you want to look out for is you might get watery eyes, maybe an itch in your throat, and even sometimes difficulty breathing, especially for those who are considered at a high-risk group. So think children, seniors, and especially those with respiratory conditions, pre-existing conditions. So we spoke with folks about how they are feeling as the onset of this thick smoke spreads across tens of millions of people. Take a listen here.
It was real hazy flying here. We could, even flying out of O'Hare, we could barely see the downtown Chicago area.
The pilot was saying to look out for the Empire State Building and such, and the Statue of Liberty, and so we're looking out, but it was just looked very hazy. You couldn't really see very much.
And the impact of smoke continues to worsen in the U.S. A recent study from Stanford University shows that over the past decade, the number of people who experience a day of poor air quality as a result of wildfire smoke has increased by 27-fold, Hallie. So that's certainly raising alarms, especially among medical experts.
Emily Aketa live for us there in New York City. Emily, thank you for being there with that reporting. Appreciate it. Want to get to some developing news relating to all things Washington and beyond, because we're just learning that Mark Meadows, according to the New York Times, the former chief of staff for Donald Trump, has testified to a grand jury in a special counsel investigation of the former president. Again, this is according to sources talking with the Times. Not clear what he was testifying about, whether it was about January 6th, whether it was about this classified documents investigation related to Mar-a-Lago. Speaking of the special counsel, that is him right there, not talking to our producer, Gary Grumbach, who was trying to ask him, hey, what's the timeline? Is this investigation wrapping up? That is the question on a lot of people's minds, including these grand juries. Yes, grand juries, plural. Because there is some reporting tonight about that. Remember, this case is all about whether Mr. Trump or not took hundreds of classified documents back to Mar-a-Lago, if he knew that he was wrong when he did that, and if he got in the government's way when he tried to get these documents back. We're also learning that there's another grand jury in Florida where Mar-a-Lago is that could hear witness testimony sometime this week, according to two people familiar with NBC News. Listen, there's just a lot of questions here. How does this Florida grand jury impact the D.C. one? Why are there two grand juries at all? Garrett Haake, let's just talk about this for a second.
Okay.
There's a lot. There's a lot happening in literally the last, 15 minutes.
I've been on my phone.
I know
during
you
the
have. I'm
intro
looking at notes that you're sending.
down.
Okay, help us, first of all, help us understand this reporting that NBC News has not confirmed. First, Mark Meadows testifying.
Yep.
Not altogether shocking. One would presume the special counsel would want to talk to the guy who was like the right-hand man of Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, credit to the New York Times for confirming a thing that I think all of us who've paid attention to this investigation thought probably happened but couldn't nail down. Meadows was Donald Trump's right-hand man for the last year and a half of his presidency, and in his post-presidency. He helped in that transition, and that makes him pivotal for not just the January 6th investigation that the special counsel is working on, but potentially the documents piece, too. Remember, there was some reporting about a week ago now, I guess, that it was in the writing of Meadows' book that Donald Trump first started talking about some of this classified documents that he may have still held on to, this Iran war plan. Again, Meadows is in the middle of everything. So I think, to me, the most interesting question, which the Times report doesn't answer and which I'm trying to figure out, too, is did Meadows kind of talk maybe against his will, pursuant to a subpoena? Did they drag him in? Did he plead the fifth? Did he stay out of it? Or did he cooperate? Did he provide significant evidence? You know, he is potentially in possession of a lot of knowledge. How forthcoming he chooses to be in this scenario could tell us a lot.
Okay, let's step back, because there is a question that has been brought up now that we have had some reporting on. Others, the New York Times has some reporting on that maybe a dozen plus Secret Service agents spoke with a grand jury in Florida. Why are there two grand juries? Is that normal?
It's not normal, but it's not so wildly unusual that it's unprecedented. So there's two different, I think, leading theories as to why this happens.
Start with leading theory. What's leading theory number one? First?
Leading theory number one is you've got a venue issue. That as the special counsel started to look into this, they realized that the crime they're investigating really took place basically only in Florida, not in Washington, D.C., and that they would lose a battle to keep it in D.C., where they might get a friendlier jury. So they have started the process of basically presenting the same evidence to grand jurors in Florida Florida, who could then, produce an indictment. The whole thing happens in Florida.
Would that restart a clock if that grand
Not
jury just
necessarily.
got
I mean, literally,
reconvened?
that grand jury could, the witnesses that grand jury could hear in that case would be like an FBI agent reading transcripts of work that they've already done. So it would slow things down a little bit, but it doesn't restart the clock. That's theory one.
What is theory number two?
Theory two is that perhaps you are spinning off different elements of this investigation in different places. So maybe only certain people get charged in Florida or certain crimes related to specific things. So if you think the classified documents problem, whatever you're going to charge on that, started in D.C., then that's a D.C.-related thing. But if there are other people involved who committed obstruction, which is one of the other things that we think might have happened, in Florida, you focus the obstruction part of the investigation in Florida. That's theory two. I don't know that we're going to know definitively the answer to this question unless and until we see indictments, but those are the working theories right now.
Unless and until we see indictments, if those come down, the until piece being significant here, because the fact that you and I are having this conversation at all and that this is getting reported out at all by other outlets and by us suggests, right, we're getting close to the end.
Yes, but I will caution here that we have learned the hard way from both our experience covering the New York indictment that did happen and the Atlanta indictments that haven't happened yet, that imminent means different things to prosecutors than it means to journalists. Remember, it was at January that the Fulton County DA said her charging decisions would be imminent.
Now it's looking like end of July, August for that.
This is like, talking in prehistoric eras, right? We're talking huge,
compared to the dinosaurs, it's all imminent.
Yes,
man.
right,
Sure,
exactly. We're all living in an imminent period. So it can mean different things. But yes, by every available sign, just frankly, the universe of witnesses to be interviewed, at least on the documents piece of this, is small. And most all of them that we can track down, including those Secret Service agents, have been interviewed. So they're running out of people to talk to. That's point one. And point two, this visit from Donald Trump's attorneys yesterday to DOJ to, in a way, kind of like, we want to speak to your manager, kind of come in and complain about the cases that exist, present their version of events, is the kind of thing that would only happen if they think the end is near. So again, near is a relative term, but we're clearly closer to the end of this than we are to the beginning.
Okay, they're going to make me wrap this up, but because you're here and because I like having this conversation with you, can you open your reporter's notebook for us? Proverbial, I know you have my phone.
Sure.
What's the thing you're looking for? Like, what's the call you're making tonight over and over again to nail a piece of this down?
I want to know who's talking in Miami that wasn't talking in Washington and why, to the point of cold calling defense attorneys in Miami and saying, like, hey, you have any clients who happen to be visiting grand jury offices?
Don't give up all your secrets, man. I didn't do
look,
that
some of
much.
this is basic one-on-one kind of stuff. No, but yeah, look, I mean, that's it, right? Like, what is happening in Miami that couldn't, for whatever reason, happen in D.C., and who knows about it?
The reason why you're looking for that is because that's a major clue. Whatever the answer is to that is a huge clue as to what's up with these two grand juries.
There are only two sets of people who are going to talk, the federal prosecutors who are involved or the defense attorneys who are probably more interested than the prosecutors in spinning things in favor of their clients.
Mr. Trump politically, the former president?
Look, they've got a playbook for this. They had a playbook. They played one hand in New York, to their view, very well. They raised a ton of money. They rallied Republicans to them. Why not try the same thing again here?
Witch hunt, I imagine, is something that we'll hear.
Well, don't show me all of your reporter's notebook secrets here, Hallie.
Garrett Haig, thank you very much, Fran. I'll let you get back on the phone. Appreciate it. Let's take you overseas, because Prince Harry is saying today the tabloid editors and journalists, some of them there, have blood on their hands. He says blood on their hands because of how far they went to get info about him and his family in the first testimony given by a senior royal in more than a century. That's why this was such a big deal as you're looking at some of these court sketches. Here he is leaving court, right? He's coming out. You see the crowds of people behind him. You had a little bit of a glance of that. Lots of security, lots of cameras after a full day of testimony. And here's the case he's making against the Mirror Group newspapers. That is one of the publisher of the Daily Mirror tabloid. Harry says they got personal scoops on him by breaking the law, he says, by doing things like hacking his phone. When he took the stand today, he said people working for these tabloids are responsible for a lot of pain, upset, and in some cases, death. Megan Fitzgerald has more.
Look, what we saw today was a defensive Prince Harry. This is certainly as suspected. And speaking with legal experts, they suspected that the attorney for MGN would go after Harry's credibility. And that's most certainly what we saw this morning, really practically right off the bat. Now, there are 33 articles that are in question that Prince Harry alleges were able to be written by obtaining information unlawfully. And so we saw this morning the attorney for MGN, Andrew Green, asking Prince Harry Harry if he actually read all 33 of those articles, to which Prince Harry responded he couldn't remember. So then, of course, that opens the door for the attorney, Mr. Green, to ask, well, then how is it that these articles impacted you so much if you don't even remember them? And Prince Harry then went on to say that every single article written about him caused him distress. We heard from the attorney really honing in on Prince Harry and asking him, well, what evidence do you have to suggest that these articles were written unlawfully? And Prince Harry pushed back and said, look, that's a question that you're going to have to ask the journalist who wrote them. And he also went on to say that, you know, he's a witness and it's not his job to really deconstruct those articles. It was certainly a difficult day for Prince Harry. He will be back again tomorrow. The judge tells us that he suspects Prince Harry's cross-examination should end by midday, but then his attorney wants the opportunity to question him. So we know that there's at least one full day left of testimony from Prince Harry before this trial moves forward. Back to you.
Our thanks to Megan Fitzgerald for that reporting. Still ahead this hour, Christie's announcement in New Hampshire tonight. You're looking live at it as he gets set to officially enter the Republican race for presidency. We're going to bring you the updates as those happen. Also, turns out coffee and olive oil make a good mix for Starbucks. We'll tell you why and where coming up. Plus, an Apple announcement that may not break the bank, the fix to a long-discussed iPhone issue. Stay with us. A new crypto crackdown from the feds tonight as the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York accuses one of the country's biggest exchanges, Coinbase, of essentially breaking the law by ignoring what the government says to do and by not protecting investors. This is not even 24 hours after the SEC sued Coinbase's biggest competitor with new charges against Binance and its founder. Now, there's no evidence that these two things are connected. In a statement, Coinbase says the SEC is hurting America's economic competitiveness. They say they're going to keep up with business as usual. I want to bring in Brian Chung, who's joining us now. Does this mean that given this new move by the government, what we've seen in the last 24 hours, it is a kind of new world order for these crypto companies?
Yeah, well, it's a big watershed moment because it's the SEC essentially getting at the heart of the cryptocurrency industry because these exchanges, Binance and Coinbase, are where the trades are done if you're swapping Bitcoin or swapping Solana or what have you. Now, when it comes to the allegations in the SEC's two actions yesterday and today, we have to remember that they're two different companies. But if we take a look at Coinbase today, they're alleging that they failed to register as a broker and exchange, that they improperly offered crypto asset securities. They made billions while depriving investors of protections. And then Binance, who they took action against yesterday, they also claim that they failed to register as a broker and exchange. But in addition to that, they said that they mishandled customer funds, that they lied to American regulators and investors, a.k.a. fraud. Now, for what it's worth, this is part of the broad posturing from SEC Chair Gary Gensler, who, at least in the case of Coinbase, said, quote, "We allege that Coinbase, despite being subject to the securities laws, commingled and unlawfully offered exchange, broker-dealer, and clearinghouse functions," end quote. I want to emphasize, as you also kind of suggested, Hallie, these are two different cases. Experts that I've spoken with have said that the merits of the Coinbase situation aren't as bad as the Binance situation, where there was literally on the record commentary that they have in the complaint of a compliance officer saying, quote, "We are operating as a expletive unlicensed securities exchange in the USA, bro." It's right there in writing.
Like, how does that, how does that end up getting put in writing? Like, isn't that kind of damning? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer.
That's what the SEC is using. Bro.
If you are interested in maybe investing in crypto, if you've been seeing all these stories about crypto in the last year and a half, what should people know? Like, what's the takeaway, whether you've invested, whether you're thinking about it? Like, I know you can't give financial advice, but like, what are the experts saying?
Right. Well, I mean, look, you look at the 2022 Super Bowl, right? There were ads all over the place in terms of crypto exchanges, crypto projects. FTX had that big ad with Larry David in it, right? I mean, a lot of big celebrities were promoting these types of cryptocurrency exchanges and cryptocurrency projects. But we have to remember that those endorsements don't necessarily tell you about the underlying risk that you take on when you play on those platforms. And that's what the regulators are trying to address here. Now, these complaints don't address the advertising side of things, but you have to remember, Coinbase and also Binance are the two largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. They didn't get there for no reason. They've been using a lot of those advertisements to get as big as they've been. You look at Shaquille O'Neal, for example. He got served by regulators on the sidelines of the Eastern Conference NBA Finals. But look, not every celebrity has endorsed these types of projects. Taylor Swift notably had an offer from FTX, but apparently thumbed her nose at it. So maybe she's a little bit more in the know than the other celebrities.
Brian Chung, I'm sure that there are many fans of hers who might agree with that sentiment. Thank you, sir. Really appreciate that. Interesting crypto stuff tonight. We've got to get to some breaking news now out of Virginia, where police are responding to some kind of a shooting incident on the campus of Virginia Commonwealth University. A high school graduation had been scheduled at the theater where this apparently happened. Students got alerts telling them to stay inside, while police say they responded to an active shooter. School officials have confirmed that a shooting did happen. We do not yet know how many people, if any, have been hurt. We are obviously staying on top of this story as you are taking a live look now at the scene where this happened. You can see people gathered. You can see, obviously, police on scene at this moment. It looks as though members of the media are being kept back, at least at somewhat of a distance from where this occurred. We have our teams all over this story. We're going to continue to bring you any updates as we get them with clearly responders that have gotten to the scene now. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, actor Cuba Gooding Jr. has settled a civil lawsuit that accused him of rape, according to court documents. A jury trial had been set to start in this case in New York today. The actor had been accused of raping a woman in his hotel room a decade ago. His lawyers had said that it was consensual. Number 2, iconic Brazilian singer Astrud Gilberto has died. She helped introduce the world to bossa nova music with the 1964 hit song, of course, The Girl from Ipanema, a track that just skyrocketed her to fame. She spent much of her life dedicated to activism and visual art. She was 83 years old. Number 3, Atlanta City Council voted early this morning to approve money for a police training facility that critics are calling Cop City. The council voted 11-4 to provide $30 million to developing this. It's set to train police officers, firefighters, first responders. Critics say it could encourage military-style policing. Number 4, Starbucks is putting its olive oil-infused coffee line into select stores in 11 new states. They call the drinks Oleato. They've been available in New York, Illinois, California, and Washington since March. So if you've been wanting to try it, there you go. Number 5, a lot of news out of Apple's developer conference, but among them, an exciting development for people who may be maybe a little more foul-mouthed. If you hate ducking autocorrect, don't worry, that's about to get changed. They'll stop changing the F word to duck or ducking. That's not useful for me. I would never write that in a text message. I would never say it. I've never even seen that correction on my phone, but for the rest of you, good luck. Coming up here on the show, one of the coldest places on Earth could soon have no ice. That's ahead in the Global. Tonight, calls for the arrest of a woman accused of killing her neighbor by firing through her front door. Still a lot of questions about what happened, but here's what we can put together so far. The lawyer for the family of the victim, his name is Ben Crump. He's a high-profile lawyer. He says that A.J. Owens' kids were playing in a field in Ocala when an unidentified white woman began yelling at them to get off her land, he says, called them racial slurs, according to Crump. Crump says the woman took some kind of iPad or tablet that the kids left there, and when one of them went back for it, she threw something and hit the child. Crump says Owens then went to speak to the neighbor, that she knocked on the door, and at that point, he says, was allegedly shot right through the door. Lindsay Reiser joins me now. So still some question marks here around, obviously, the situation and what happened. Tell us more about the details that we do know and where this goes next.
So, Hallie, police are saying that there was an ongoing feud between Ajika A.J. Owens and this neighbor. There had been some 6 to 8 incidents in the past in which police had been called out. And while you mentioned they're not disputing Benjamin Crump or the family's version of events that happened on Friday, they are saying that this started with a dispute with the children, between the children and the neighbor. So according to civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who's representing the family right now, Owens' children were playing in a field near an apartment or duplex complex when this 58-year-old white woman yelled at them to get off her property and allegedly, according to Crump and the family, called them racial slurs. The children ran away, but they forgot an iPad or a tablet of some sort. So one of the children went to the neighbor's home to try and retrieve it. That is when Crump and Owens' family say that that neighbor threw something either at or directed toward the child, which police say was a pair of skates, struck the child, and the child went home to tell his mother, A.J. Owens. Owens came to talk to the neighbor, and that is when According to police who have interviewed the shooter, things got very tense. It was a heated exchange. Both sides were being very aggressive. There was banging on the door or wall. There were threats being made. Ultimately, while Owens' family says that door never opened, that neighbor shot through the door, striking Owens and ultimately killing her. And police say 2 of her 4 children were witnesses to this. Officers responded. It had essentially been a trespassing call. And by the time they got there, she was already wounded and she was pronounced deceased at the hospital. Now, this neighbor has not been charged or anything of the like, has not been arrested. And so there are calls right now to do so, but the sheriff's office is asking everybody to not jump to any conclusions.
How does Florida stand your ground law come into play in this case?
So, Hallie, this is something obviously that we have covered and we have heard about other cases in which this comes into play. The sheriff's office is saying if there is even a hint of a stand your ground element to this, then they cannot make an immediate arrest, according to the law that they have there in Florida. So they have to investigate and find out whether the deadly force was justified or not. So they say that this neighbor is cooperating, and of course, Owens' family completely distraught. They say she was a loving mother. She was a football and cheerleading mother. She was a manager in a restaurant industry. The sheriff's office also says that they are waiting, Hallie, to interview the children who witnessed this, and obviously they're very traumatized, and so they're waiting a little bit to do so, Hallie.
Lindsay Reiser, thank you very much. I want to take you back now to that developing news out of Virginia with police on the scene outside, apparently, of a high school graduation, according to Richmond Public Schools. Dana Griffin is joining us now. And Dana, I understand in the last couple of minutes, we've got another update from police.
Yeah, well, right now they are not confirming or denying how many people have been shot. But according to our local affiliate, they confirmed that there are some injuries. We want to be careful about what we're reporting because we want to make sure that it meets our standards here. But we know that this happened around 5:30 local time. There was a graduation ceremony happening at the time. That's when, according to Richmond, Virginia Public Schools, a shooting happened outside of the theater. It's unclear exactly if this was targeting a specific person or if this was random. We know that an alert went out to VCU students telling them to avoid the area, but that there was, quote, no threat to the public. So that may have some indication that a suspect has been caught or maybe neutralized in this situation. We know that a second high school graduation was set for later this evening. That has since been canceled. The school system saying that they will reschedule that graduation as authorities try to begin this investigation, figure out what happened. Again, we are waiting to get an update on how many people have been shot here near the campus of the Virginia Commonwealth University. Hallie?
Dana Griffin, obviously we have our teams working on more information. You can see we've been looking on the left side of the screen here, live pictures from a distance of what's believed to be looking towards the Altria Theater at VCU there, of course, that college near the campus, at least. I'm looking to see if we can see anything else, like, for example, perhaps police gathering. We understand that there's likely to be a briefing happening at some point soon. We're going to keep you posted on this story. We are watching, obviously, for every development on it as we get new details. We are also watching what's happening up in New Hampshire with Christie getting ready to make his announcement. We'll be right back. NBC News covers hundreds of international stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our foreign desk has done it for you. Here is some of what they're watching in a segment we call The Global. Out of Haiti, at least 4 people have been killed, dozens more hurt after an earthquake hit today. You're seeing some of the damage here, 4.9 magnitude. Some homes collapsed. 3 of the people who died were found under one of those houses that had fallen down. Haiti's been recovering from flooding over the weekend that killed more than 40 people, hurt more than 100, and flooded 30,000 homes. Just a very tough stretch there. From the Arctic, imagine the Arctic without sea ice. Well, a new study projects there may be almost none of it left during part of the summer as soon as the 2030s. That's a decade earlier than what previous studies had found. Researchers said that's because of there's sort of reflected projections on emissions and the impact on the Arctic. They said an ice-free Arctic is something to prepare for. And out of France today, World War II veterans and others marking the 79th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, remembering the deadly fighting that freed Western Europe from Nazi control. Ceremonies included a tribute to young soldiers on those famous beaches now of Normandy. People brought flowers, they waved U.S. flags. Elsewhere in France, in Paris, some fallout from a day of protests and unrest, with hundreds of thousands turning out to demonstrate against that law we've been talking about that raised the retirement age by 2 years. It was a scene in some places in the city. I mean, you're looking at this, people setting trucks on fire, dumpsters on fire. I mean, literal dumpster fires in the streets. Police responded. They used tear gas to disperse the crowds, 11,000 officers, including 4,000 in Paris alone. Just the latest in protests there over this retirement law. Matt Bradley is joining us from Paris now. Are these protests different from what we saw before this law was passed?
No, not really, Hallie. And you know what? The only thing that really made them different is that they're actually quite a bit smaller. They're about half the size of the peak level of protests that we've seen in the past couple of months. And, you know, all of that violence you just mentioned, the burning, the police scuffles, you know, all of that is actually what makes this typical rather than atypical. But the one thing that we're seeing here that was interesting is that a lot of the protesters are looking forward to Thursday, day after tomorrow, and that's when they're expecting a new law to be introduced into Parliament, the National Assembly here in France, that would reverse that law that was just passed back in April, that's already been published in the official Gazette here in France, that really promulgates that move, raising the age of retirement by 2 years. So in many ways, this was kind of a desperate last-ditch effort to try to push legislators to try to reverse that law. And it's something that, you know, we talked to some people, you know, they said that there's still hope, even though there doesn't sound like there's going to be hope. You know, they can, but the parliament is saying, and a lot of the leaders in parliament are saying that they're going to block it, that they're going to kind of just snuff this out before it even starts on Thursday. I spoke with one of the protesters. Here's what she told me.
It's no finish. I mean, next day will be a very important fight in our assembly, and this manifestation is part of this fight in order to rehab or take it over rights.
So, as you can see, people are hoping that this is actually going to work. But your question, can they actually do that? Well, you know, a lot of the constitutional rules, a lot of the legislative rules here in France, they say they can't. They say they might not even be able to put that legislation on the floor so that it could even be discussed. So in many ways, this effort to try to reverse the previous rule, it's kind of been stillborn already.
Matt Bradley live for us there in Paris. Matt, thank you very much. Thanks for being out there for us tonight. More to get to here in the show, including a potential news conference on that reported shooting near Virginia Commonwealth University sometime in the next couple of minutes. We will bring that to you live when it happens. Stay with us. We are taking you live now back to New Hampshire, where you are looking at the newest candidate in the Republican race for the White House. Now, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie there in Manchester, New Hampshire at a town hall. He has made his run for the White House official, filing that paperwork earlier tonight. Now the big campaign rollout. And he has said, if you are in search of the perfect candidate, I'm not it, saying he is far from the perfect person, but saying we cannot dismiss the question of character anymore. That is obviously a dig at former President Donald Trump. I want to bring in Shaq Brewster, who is live for us in Manchester. Chris Christie's been speaking for roughly 26 minutes, I believe, Shaq, but hasn't said those words yet. I'm running for president. We know he is because he filed the paperwork. Talk to us about the moment, what the room is like, and what the vibe is.
Yeah, we're still in. I'm going to keep a more muted tone because I'm actually in the overflow room. We didn't realize that was what this was initially, but we are still waiting for that moment, Hallie, where he announces that he is an official candidate for president. But he is definitely alluding to that idea. He's framing this in an idea of the country being big or small and going in which direction. He did mention former President Trump, but he mentioned him in the context of Barack Obama, of Joe Biden, saying that leaders at this moment have chosen to be small. And he said this wasn't a layup for him. It's not a decision that came easy for him. But because of the direction of the country, he wants the country to go big, in his words, and he's suggesting that is the reason why he will be jumping into this race. You mentioned he's been speaking for about 24 or so minutes at this point, so we're still waiting for that official announcement to come, but I think we're getting a sense of the framing that we talked about, that yes, he will draw that direct contrast with former President Trump, but he is also trying to do that by suggesting he wants to see the country go in a different direction, and specifically the Republican Party go in a different direction direction. That's kind of the tone that he's been taking at this point, Hallie.
Shaq Brewster, I urge you to read me my evening meditations in that golf whisper voice of yours. Thank you for being so respectful of the people in the overflow room next to you. Let me go to Mark Murray, who's sitting in a studio and does not have those same concerns. Mark, one of the questions for Chris Christie, right, as he is rolling out his campaign, it's this annoying question that political pundits ask. What's the lane? But in this instance, it is a fair question. Chris Christie's lane, right, is the anti-Trump lane in the Republican primary. Is there an appetite for that in the Republican base?
Yeah, the polling numbers actually suggest no, Hallie. And of course, I think from a media standpoint, and yes, you are right about different kind of lanes that some were running. Ron DeSantis, for example, the Florida governor, is kind of running in a lot of ways to the right of Donald Trump. You end up having Chris Christie coming from the anti-Trump lane. But when we look at the polling, according to a recent Monmouth poll, you just had 21% of Republican voters who ended up holding Christie in high regard versus 47% in negative regard. That is the lowest. That was the lowest mark that any Republican had in that poll, and one of the lowest scores that we've seen for anyone running for president of their own party. And so it is a very uphill. Hallie, I'm also struck by the fact that Chris Christie is in New Hampshire doing this. Remember, a place like Iowa with its evangelical conservatives, not probably the best turf for someone like Chris Christie, who was the former governor of New Jersey. So he's once trying to rekindle any kind of magic in New Hampshire, but it's worth noting that he finished 6th place in the New Hampshire primary in 2016.
Mark Murray, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. We got lots more coverage coming up here on NBC News Now, but for us, that is a wrap. And for the hour before it, if you missed any of it, catch up on the latest reporting and the newest interviews from our team. You can find us anytime in so many places, including Peacock, Hulu, YouTube. Just search Hallie Jackson Now. Top Story picks up coverage right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.